odor and sound, whatnot. Berkeley is in full agreement with other empiricists before him, namely Locke, who argued that these tend to be ideas. They do tend to be dependent on the human mind. However, he disagrees with prior empiricists when it comes to the primary qualities. So Berkeley argues, and there might be something to this argument here, that it is impossible to conceive of primary qualities apart from secondary qualities. So, for example, we cannot think of motion, which is a primary quality, unless we think of something in motion. I mean, try to do it. I mean, close your eyes and try to think of motion itself. Well, when I think of motion, I think of a car that's moving, driving down the road. I think of a runner. You could think of a ball rolling across the floor. All of those would be examples of motion. But it's very difficult, I mean, if not impossible, to think of pure motion itself. I mean, like the examples I just gave of the car, of a person running, or a ball rolling across the floor. All of those are examples of motion combined with a secondary quality. So when I think of a car, I mean, there has to be color to it, right? There has to be a texture to it. I mean, there's a sound that it makes. The same thing with a runner. I can't just think of running in and of itself. I mean, I think of someone who's doing the running. And yeah, I might be making up that person, imagining a person. But Berkeley's point is that, well, he thinks it's impossible to think of a primary quality abstracted from a secondary quality. So since both primary and secondary qualities are not dependent or not independent of perception, meaning they're mind dependent, he thinks ultimately they have to be an idea. So there's no such thing as pure matter itself. I mean, pure matter itself doesn't exist, according to Berkeley, independent of the mind. I mean, matter itself would be an idea of the human mind. Hence, material, physical substances do not exist in the ordinary sense of the word exist, as something that's independent of the mind. So I think to understand what Berkeley is getting at here, we really have to pick up on this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. From my reading of him, this is really the hinge on which his entire argument turns. I mean, if it is possible to think of primary qualities without incorporating secondary qualities, then, at least the way I'm reading him, his argument wouldn't have much merit to it. It wouldn't be a very strong argument. But if he's right in this distinction, and if he's right that when we think of primary qualities, we have to incorporate secondary qualities, and secondary qualities are ideas, as empiricists of his time admitted, well, wouldn't we then be forced to conclude that primary qualities are ideas as well? In which case, that would mean that sensible reality really isn't sensible reality at all. It's really just an idea or a collection of ideas that are dependent on the human mind. Now, it's important to note here what Berkeley isn't saying. He's not saying that tables and chairs, that there's no such thing as tables and chairs, that somehow these are just figments of our imagination. That's really not what he's saying, and it's real easy to read him and to come to the conclusion that he's either denying tables and chairs altogether, or that he's somehow making them just a product of our imagination, that they come into existence, then they go out of existence. I mean, that's really not what he's saying. I mean, what he is attacking here is Locke's idea of a material substance that we can think about and conceive apart from secondary qualities. And this would get back and tie into what I said earlier about the threat of materialism and a skepticism. To say that there are no such things as material physical substances, that would tend to, eradicate the entire threat of materialism. Because in reality, there would be no such thing as material substances. Matter wouldn't exist apart from the mind. So we have to kind of keep that in mind when we're thinking about Berkeley. He's really battling, in his mind anyway, against materialism and skepticism. In many ways, he's trying to construct an argument that will challenge those ideas that have become real popular in his time. Okay, so finally, let's talk about divine perception. So the question would be, the question you're probably thinking is, well, if I'm not in my room right now, or if I step outside and no one is here in the room to perceive my computer, does that mean that the computer pops out of existence? And that when I come back into the room, somehow magically the computer pops into existence because all of a sudden I'm here to perceive it. So recall Berkeley's formulation, to be is to be perceived, or existence is dependent upon perception. Perception being an activity of the mind. Well, it's a good question to ask. All right, if I step out of the room, does every physical or every sensible object in this room somehow disappear? Well, not so for Berkeley. Because God, he argues, is the great perceiver. As an omnipresent being, God is everywhere at all times, according to Berkeley. And because of that, because he's omnipresent, he perceives all things. So even when I'm not in this room, there's still a being out there that's perceiving what's going on in this room. So if I step out of the room, it's not the case that the chair I'm sitting on, the table I'm working on, the computer in front of me would somehow go out of existence. Because even when I leave the room, God is still there to perceive these realities. So the existence of the table, chair, and the computer would still get down to perception, but it wouldn't be my perception. It would be God's perception. So these objects would continue to exist even though I'm not in the room, or even though no object is in the room. Another thing to think about in this context is, well, right now I'm sitting in a room by myself, but no one's here to perceive me. Okay, so would that mean that I don't exist because there's not another human finite mind in here that's gazing upon me, perceiving me? Well, not so for Berkeley, because even when I'm in this room alone, the ever-looming presence of God would be perceiving me. So because God is the great perceiver, things will continue to exist, even though there's not a human, finite mind who's doing the perceiving. So I know it's an outlandish philosophy, but I think if we look at it from Berkeley's perspective, we can see that as a bishop and as someone who is deeply concerned about materialism, and skepticism, this is a way for him to preserve God in philosophy, and also to put up a challenge to the materialists and the skeptics, those who are arguing that matter is, or that reality is reducible to matter, and that human knowledge is really impossible. Berkeley's philosophy is a challenge to those ideas, as well as a way of preserving the idea of God in modernity. Okay, that's probably enough Berkeley for now. If you have any questions, let me know. You can shoot me an email. If you haven't read it, go through, read it. I think you'll find it challenging and definitely thought-provoking. Okay, I'll see you soon.